complexity is the world built of relationships. And it's a very different thing to engage what is true or real in a complexity framework than it is to engage in it in what is a modernist Western Enlightenment ambition to identify the absolute objective properties that are intrinsic in any given thing. Everyone is grappling with the fact that the world is exhibiting itself so much in these entanglements of relationships. The arts are completely at home in that world. And so we've been sort of under the thumb of the old world. We've always been a kind of second-class citizen in an Enlightenment rationalist society. But once we move out of that world and we move into a complexity framework, suddenly the arts are entirely at home, and we have capacity in that world that a lot of other sectors don't have. And so what I've been trying to do with this report is really articulate the way in which these different disruptions are putting us in a very different reality. And it's a reality in which we go from being a kind of secondary entertaining class to maybe having a capacity to sit at the heart of a lot of really critical problem-solving challenges.
Conscient Podcast. It's March 25th, 2021, and I'm with David Maggs in Vancouver, and we're having a socially distanced conversation, or at least an outdoor one. So, David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
It's the first recording I'm doing of the season. I'm going to actually publish it later because you have a paper coming out in April. But I wanted to take the opportunity to have a conversation with you because that's what this season is about, talking with thought leaders and people who are working in and around arts and culture, but also on the issues that I'm interested in, which is the notion of reality, which we could talk a lot about, and also working through ecological grief, because I, as a person, have gone through a process of working through those things, and I did a piece called Reality that you'll listen to at some point. And so now I'm talking to people about what that means to them and what they're doing. And I know you're very active in the community. I've known you over the years as a thinker and a doer. I've been to many events that you've organized. So why don't we start by you just telling us a bit about who you are, and people can read your full bio. But and then we'll just have a conversation for about 20 minutes before you go to your next appointment.
So I guess there's different ways of introducing oneself. I'm from Newfoundland, and I think that has a lot of bearing on who I am. I grew up in a part of the world that was very close to the ground in terms of it's a primary resource economy. It's a place that lives based on its connection to natural resources, and that's been a very big theme in Newfoundland's fate over the past few centuries. I grew up as a piano player. I fell in love with classical music and saw a kind of destiny in Mozart and Beethoven and all those old guys. And then about, in my mid-20s, I'd finished an artist diploma at the Glenn Gould School, and I realized I was not connecting with the world in the way that I wanted to. And I shifted away from playing the piano exclusively to connecting the challenges of sustainability with the capacities of the arts and trying to understand what does it mean to make really strong translations between sustainability problems and artistic capacity.
In a nutshell, among many other things. So how do you react to the idea of accepting reality and you know that whole notion of what is real and what is not? Does that journalist Jack Miles. Reality, as defined by the Oxford Dictionary, is the state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to an idealistic or notional idea of them. Instead of being the method through which we observe a thing, reality is the nature or truth of this thing.
I think that's a really interesting way of shaping the challenge of sustainability, because sustainability has emerged out of a science of ecology, which was about really demonstrating the hard and fast brute natural facts of the planet and the kind of planet as a natural object. And so that's a sort of modernist or Enlightenment way of engaging with the state that the planet is in. And it's useful as a descriptive exercise. What's been interesting about that is that reality may have created a lot of grief, and it may have created a lot of sense of guilt. Shame, I think, is another thing that humans are experiencing at a very high level. Stress, anxiety. And so the club of reality has been useful in maybe creating a wake-up, a fairly urgent wake-up, but it hasn't been very useful in getting us out of bed. It hasn't been the sort of thing that's created a sense of, now I know what to do, or now I feel a level of agency. And so one of the things that's so puzzling about the sustainability problem is that in one sense it's about describing the way the planet is, whether we like it or not, but in another sense it's describing the fact that the planet is in our hands in a way that it's never been before, that we are now making that reality. And so for a long time we tried to determine the things we should value by the facts that we could assert. And now suddenly we're in a circumstance where it's our values and it's our meanings and our identities that are actually now determining the facts of the planet. The sky above our head is not just a result of atmospheric physics anymore. It's our energy plans, it's our mobility solutions, it's our dietary choices. And so suddenly our values are determining our reality in a way that's really fascinating. And in one sense, that should be terrifying. But in another sense, it should be that should be one of the more inspiring things that we understand through the sustainability crisis. That we now have a chance to make the world. And that's an opportunity that we've never had before. It's a huge ethical challenge. It's a huge challenge for our values, but it's an invitation to our agency. It's an invitation to our capacity that is so important at this moment.
Cultural theorist Thomas Berry. Our challenge is to create a new language, even a new sense of what it is to be human. It is to transcend not only national limitations, but even our species' isolation, to enter into the larger community of living species. This brings about a completely new sense of reality and value. Oh, that resonates with me. I'm a practitioner of Zen, and so in my Zen practice, the idea with daily sitting is to experience reality, right? Mm. And at one point I was doing research for the program, and I was reading Yuval Harari and how he talks about how a lot of the institutions around us are actual fictional stories, like the institution of money or of capitalism, and that we can, if we change the narrative, and I know that you're working on issues of not just narrative but imaginary worlds, and so I wanted to jump into that world of what do we know is true, what do we know to be real, and money is a convention. It's like it's something that we've developed that has advantages and disadvantages. But when you start looking at the world and seeing it for what it really is, especially on an ecological level, what is actually happening to the environment, it changes the way you see the institutions. And being an artist, well, we play with stories all the time, right? I'm early in my research because I'm still figuring it out every day. We were just talking a minute ago about how so much is being written right now about issues of climate change, but also the larger issue of sustainability. So people they've been waking up for years, but more and more, they're not just waking up, they're activating their brains and their bodies to figure out what are they going to do and who are they responsible to, you know? I feel responsible to my children, to my community, to my society, but also to the trees around me and to the environment. So that sense of responsibility is evolving. Historian Yuval Harari. If you think about any religion, any economic system, any political system, at the basis you will find some fictional story about God, about money, about human rights, about a nation. All of these things are fictional stories. They are not a biological reality. But it's a very powerful and convincing and benign fiction that helps us organize our political and legal systems in the modern world. So you're writing. You've written an article that I think that I read, or mostly. I'm not finished it yet, but it's really good, and I encourage everyone to listen to read it, because it nails a lot of the issues that I've been trying to grapple with myself around the role of art. Mm-hmm. So could you tell me a bit about the article that you've written? Sure. And what you're trying to do with it?
So the Metcalfe Foundation in Toronto approached me to look at themes of disruption and transformation in the arts sector. These have been pretty loud over the past year. And I immediately took that as a sort of invitation to talk about the pandemic. And it took really no time for me to realize that if we were looking at disruption in the arts sector, we weren't just talking about a pandemic. We were talking about huge issues of social justice. We were talking about a massive disruption of our industry. And we were talking about a disruption of our world in the shape of the climate crisis. And so what I tried to do was, in talking to different arts organizations, you immediately got this sense of fatigue, that they were playing a game of whack-a-mole as they were jumping from one crisis to another, trying to get their organization stabilized. And I thought, if we continue to try and engage these different disruptions one at a time, it's going to exploit our weaknesses and make us look uniquely incapable relative to other sectors. But if we can integrate these different disruptions, if there's a pattern here, if we can take them as a constellation rather than sort of four ominous stars in the sky, my hunch was that actually exploits our strengths instead, and then the arts sector becomes uniquely capable instead of suddenly constantly scrambling. And so then you have the question, well, what is that integration? What is the constellation that's made by these different disruptions? And so if we look at the disruption of the pandemic and the disruption of social justice and the disruption of industry largely at the hands of the digital revolution and the disruption of climate, we immediately find ourselves in the realm of complexity. And what is the realm of complexity? It goes back to your question about reality. And the simplest way to think about it is that we have to start understanding our reality not as the kinds of properties that we can describe in individual entities, but the relationships that exhibit between those entities. Complexity is the world built of relationships, and it's a very different thing to engage what is true or real in a complexity framework than it is to engage in it in what is a modernist Western Enlightenment ambition to identify the absolute objective properties that are intrinsic in any given thing. And so that shift that's happening all over the world, right? That's happening in physics, that's happening in politics, it's happening in economics. Everyone is grappling with the fact that the world is exhibiting itself so much in these entanglements of relationships. The arts are completely at home in that world. Mm. And so we've been sort of under the thumb of the old world. We've always been a kind of second-class citizen in an Enlightenment rationalist society. But once we move out of that world and we move into a complexity framework, which often goes by the name the Anthropocene, as one way of naming that sort of complexity framework or the complex world, suddenly the arts are entirely at home, and we have capacity in that world that a lot of other sectors don't have. And so what I've been trying to do with this report is really articulate the way in which these different disruptions are putting us in a very different reality. And it's a reality in which we go from being a kind of secondary entertaining class to maybe having a capacity to sit at the heart of a lot of really critical problem-solving challenges. And so that's the sort of effort of the report, and then trying to identify, well, what is it that we need to do if we're going to be able to address and engage that capacity and mobilize it in our society.
And so it's a 40-page report, and there's an executive summary for those who might not have time. But what is your key message then to the arts community? What do you want them to think about through that report?
Yeah, so I was talking to Michael Trent and Sandy Houston from the Metcalfe Foundation about that exact question. What is the single takeaway? First of all, it would be completely contradictory to write a report about arts and complexity, arts in a kind of emergent reality, and then give a list of to-dos. So it's very much a kind of an exploration of how we should think rather than what we should do. But then what that means in terms of how we should think about these things. I mean, the first thing I think we need to do is we need to really recognize what our unique value proposition is. And the arts have been trying to get more involved in saving the world over the past few decades. But my sense is that they've not done it with a real clear sense of what their unique value proposition is. What do we do as an arts sector better than anyone else?
Or different, anyway.
Or different. I don't want to say better, but yes, you're probably wise to say different. And it's our capacity to engage with the world in terms of the aesthetic, to engage with the world in terms of color and form and shape and texture and pattern and imagery and line and rhythm and harmony. Those elements are a way of measuring the world. And it's a particularly useful way of measuring the world because it's intersubjective. It's a relational way of knowing. And so I'm really interested then in saying, we've got to center that value within this complexity framework and say, look, one of the things that we bring to the table is a capacity to engage with and build a sense of reality outside of the limits of our rational categories, which have shown themselves to be inadequate all over the place. Yeah. And so that piece is really important. So the second message of that is that we have to start to work as a system much more than we've ever had to before. So not a kind of collection of similar entities, but a really integrated, we love to say cultural ecology or the cultural ecosystem. We have to prove that true over the next decade in a really critical way. And so that's a big challenge. And then the last piece I think is around learning and the capacity of our sector to learn. How well do we learn for ourselves and how well do we learn from each other? And so figuring out what is it that we need to put in place to become what in tech speak is called a smart sector, or a sector that's got the capacity to learn from its doing.
Artist David Haley. We now need aesthetics to sensitize us to other ways of life. And we need artists to sensitize us to the shape of things to come. And I'm sure you're open to be challenged on some of your ideas, because that's part of the game, right?
That is my favorite response. Yes, I'd rather have the critical engagement more than the
and I'm not saying that I'm critical of it. In fact, I appreciate the fact that Metcalf and you have written a piece that is a conversation starter. But more than that, sort of a bedrock for moving forward, because I have noticed a lack of coherence, or at least a lack of connection between many good initiatives across the country and around the world around the role of art. Many theories have been put in place, but we need to work together, yes, and we need to figure out commonalities. For instance, the design world, they say, well, what about us? We're literally designing things. And so I think the arts and cultural sector have a lot of potential to be key players. I agree with you in not just climate change, because climate change is a symptom of a larger issue, right? And people have to, we're not going to resolve climate change overnight. In fact, it's so advanced. This is one of the things that I talk about in the podcast, is that there's so much baked in climate disruption already that we will never be able to change, that we're going into a world we will not be able to recognize. So we have to reinvent ourselves. And I say that, with a lot of modesty, because who am I to say that, right? But I think that's what's needed. And then how are we going to do that? How are we going to live on this planet, future forward, knowing the damage that we've already created that we can't change, and that slowing down the damage, which we should do in every way we can. How can we live well? How can we have meaningful, loving, engaged lives? But it's really, how do we want to live? And I live my life through arts and culture because it makes sense to me, right? One doesn't have to do that, but I think those are the issues that are on the table, and I'm happy that you've written this piece and that you've taken time to start a conversation with me. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we end? That
I mean, as you talk about that, I think about the challenge of reconciliation in Canada, and one of the things I try to do in this paper is just reposition our relationship with that challenge slightly. We've taken that on as a kind of ethical challenge. It's the thing we need to do because it's morally right. And of course, that's an important foundation. What this moment has shown us is, as we turn to complexity, our relationship with reconciliation doesn't just have a moral imperative. It has a massive strategic imperative. Where do we go to learn how to work with a relational universe, a universe governed by complexity? It's written into Indigenous ways of knowing. And so we turn to our relationship with Indigenous Canada with a level of need and a sincerity now that transcends just a moral imperative. And I hope that has a kind of energizing proposition for our relationship with Indigenous Canada, because that relationship is more critical now than ever, and not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the thing we need to do in order to survive. So that's something that I don't know how that piece will play out, but I hope that's something that really matures and takes on momentum as this report hits the ground.
Writer Robin Wall Kimmerer. The land is the real teacher. All we need as students is mindfulness. Well, thank you, David. We're going to walk back to your apartment here in Vancouver.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure to have these few moments, and I have the feeling that your paper and what you're doing now will resonate with artists, and also will make them uncomfortable, because many are going through the pain and the difficulty of surviving the COVID crisis, right? Mm-hmm. And so some people are saying, well, think of the COVID crisis as an opportunity, but it's easier said than done, right? When you're struggling to just survive as an arts organization. So I think that we have to be sensitive to that, but the I don't like the word opportunity, but certainly there's circumstance right now. There's growing momentum that we can and must do things differently, mm-hmm. and we can and must do things together. Mm-hmm. And those sound cliche, but when they're done, you start to see the impact, and you start seeing that the world is reshaping itself, mm-hmm. that the signal has been received that we need to change. So
I think absolutely. I asked everybody when I interviewed them if you could press a button and make this pandemic not happen. Nobody said yes. I mean, that's not to be cavalier about the fact that many people have suffered a lot, but I think it was a diagnostic of the fact the sector knows we're in this moment now, and I think they don't want to step away from it, which I find, as you say, tremendously reassuring.